We have the Athletics' David Ornstein, as well as our Arsenal writer, Art de Roche. All right, David, let's start with you on this. The manner of Arsenal's Champions League exit last night, did it just highlight some of the shortages of what this team are lacking, especially at the highest level?
I'm glad we're recording this the day after the game, because it's allowed everybody to take a bit of a step back, let the dust settle, gain a bit of perspective and discuss it in a calm way. And that sort of encapsulates the fact that Arsenal have come far under Mikel Arteta in his, 5 years in charge. They have progressed. They are moving in the right direction. There is so much for Arsenal to be pleased about, proud about, excited about, on and off the pitch. And they are now competitive again, which they weren't for a long time. They'd been 7 years outside the Champions League. They'd been 14 years outside of the Champions League quarterfinals. And they're now back at the top table. And that's a great place to be. However, it's all relative. And so once you get there, you want to do well. You want to go further. You see what Arsenal have done in the Premier League for the second consecutive season. You know what they're capable of. You're aware of their weapons. And you're left wondering what might have been in a season where Bayern Munich have really struggled, despite the fact it is still Bayern Munich and they were still on home turf last night. You look at moments across the two legs, the uncharacteristic mistake featuring Gabriel, David Raya and Declan Rice for the equaliser at the Emirates Stadium. Arsenal's failure to come out of that tie with an advantage, a wake-up call that Bayern Munich have some serious threatening players in their own right. They gave Arsenal a bigger test, really, footballing-wise, than we've seen in months. Even the Manchester City away game in the Premier League wasn't as tough as that, I don't think, because they cancelled each other out. And then when you come to the second leg in the Allianz Arena, at this level, as Mikel Arteta said, the margins are fine. You need to take your chances. Gabriel Martinelli didn't. There were moments that Arsenal will look back on, such as the Bukayo Saka free kick right at the death that he took quickly, the corner into the box with virtually the last kick, with everybody inside the area that didn't beat the first man. The referee's decision not to award a corner to Martin Odegaard when his close effort was saved just before that. You'll look at individuals' performances that just weren't quite there when it really mattered. You look at some of the exhaustion that this squad seems to be experiencing now. The way they have stuttered in April yet again, and people have pointed out that, it's happened in the last 3 seasons under Mikel Arteta. Well, I remember it happening under Unai Emery. I remember it happening under Arsene Wenger. This is a trait that needs to be discussed and looked at internally and externally. And so Arsenal will come out of it a sense of what if, certainly some regrets and frustration. However, there is no time to dwell on it and have their heads down. They have this within their grasp to bounce back at Wolves and sort of regain the Premier League ascendancy, with Manchester City not playing in the Premier League this weekend. And stranger things have happened. I really didn't like against Aston Villa the way that when Arsenal went a goal down, it seemed to knock them for 6 and they conceded a second. And my mind immediately cast back to the final day of last season when Manchester City went 2-0 down at home to Aston Villa and they came out fighting like animals. That's what Arsenal need to do now in the title race. Leave nothing on the pitch. Turn over every stone to keep competitive until the end of the season. Don't let this flit away. And then, as some people have pointed out, they'll win 5-0 against Everton on the final day in the sun. Everyone will cheer, go and have a great summer. Arsenal have missed out again. Now, this is all easier said than done. There are many factors that we'll come on to talk about. But I don't think it's a time for massive despondency. I think it's a time for Arsenal to realise how far they've come, and now attack the future and start to put this right. And they need to put it right in a number of areas.
Yeah, Art, losing to a 6-time Champions League winning team who are seasoned in this competition, I guess there is some comfort in that. And Arsenal not necessarily having those street smarts. And David has just alluded to it, first time in this stage in 14 years or whatever for Arsenal. It's massive. So a lot of learning, but also I guess the acceleration of the team as well needs to be thought about here. We spoke about Liverpool in a previous pod, and the loss in Europe denting their hopes. If we're talking about progression with this team, as David also just alluded to, you would like to see them bounce back from this and just focus solely on the Premier League.
Yeah, I think where I guess the disappointment also comes from, both from the second half against Aston Villa and the performance against Bayern Munich, is it felt like the players on the pitch were almost taking half measures most of the time, rather than believing in themselves fully and actually trying to grasp the opportunity that was there. And now when you go back into the Premier League, I think that's all you can ask of them, to actually take full measures and fully go for it, because 2 points isn't a lot. It can be clawed back. It is Manchester City who they're fighting against, and with Liverpool too, who are also on 71 points. But I think now you need to go back into the Premier League and almost prove why you're in the position you are, which again, as David said, is easier said than done. But I think when you perform as you did collectively at Bayern, there needs to be a sort of urgency to put that right, because it is so uncharacteristic and different from what's happened in the, say, 6-7 months before that.
David, I'm just thinking about Mikel Arteta and what this says about his managerial prowess and what he's learning as a manager as well, because, he has to turn his team around very, very quickly. And as we've alluded to, Arsenal going out, with a whimper in the Premier League harks back to last season. Those ghosts are still looming around. Mikel Arteta needs to find something within himself to get his players ready for the next match against Wolves.
Yeah, he does. And many seem to forget or decline to consider the fact that Mikel Arteta is still young. He's in his first number one managerial job. And he started well by winning the FA Cup in 2020. He has taken players on, he's taken the team on, he's taken the club and the culture, the environment on from where it was before. It wasn't so long ago that Arsenal were not playing in European football. They weren't playing in the Champions League. They're now going to have their second consecutive season in that competition. But with progress comes shifting expectations around individuals, around the collective, around the executives, and definitely around the manager. And Mikel Arteta will be learning. I remember perceived mistakes. It's easy for us to say, but things you could scrutinise when Arsenal went out of the Europa League to Unai Emery's Villarreal under Mikel Arteta. And I saw little things that were not too dissimilar this time round. And that will take a strong staff around him, who are prepared to challenge him. He's actually got quite a young staff, although Albert Stovenberg is a bit older, but many of the members of that coaching team are young themselves. And so it will take Edu as sporting director, Richard Garlick as managing director. He's replacing Vinay Venkatesham essentially as chief executive. The Cronkies as owners, to make sure they support and challenge Mikel Arteta, and he will do that more than anybody. The introspection's really important. But as he's grown in power at that club, it's not easy to question him internally, and so there will be a bit of that going on. He's only under contract until the summer of 2025, and so that's something that is naturally going to be on the agenda anytime now, whether they're going to hold talks, whether they've already held talks, whether they are going to reach an agreement. No doubt other clubs will be looking at him regardless of what happens around his Arsenal status, and that's reflective of the regard in which he has become held throughout the game. But it is a test of his mettle now. There's no sort of sympathy. There's no rules around age. Just because I say that he's young and things are still relatively embryonic there. Many clubs will say, well, Jurgen Klopp had this many years and Pep Guardiola, and, around football, there's goodwill is in relatively short supply and fan bases are demanding, and Arsenal, risk going another season without a trophy. It's not an easy thing to do. Many others do as well, but by their own expectations. He does need to step up, and there are certain parts of the team, and we'll come on to talk about it, that need solving. The goal scoring area, parts of the central midfield, huge uncertainty over so many players in the squad. We could see a very different group going into next season and the years ahead. There are steps they've taken to sort of upgrade by bringing in the likes of Gabriel Jesus and Alexander Zinchenko from Manchester City, seasoned winners, very experienced, high quality, lauded and helped bring Arsenal on. But our colleague Jordan Campbell wrote a piece the other day sort of asking whether Arsenal have already gone past that stage now and whether players like that need to be moved on and upgrades brought into the club. So this is a really critical time for Mikel Arteta. The competition is going to be more fierce than ever. You've got Manchester City. Pep Guardiola is going to be there, we think until 2025, which is contract states. Whether he goes beyond that or not, we don't know, but they'll be at the forefront. Liverpool are going to try and fight back with their new manager, post-Klopp. Manchester United with their Ineos ownership, whether it's Erik ten Hag or somebody else, they've got to get competitive again. Chelsea are going to throw everything at it, not least a huge amount of finance. Tottenham are lingering and trying to strive under Ange Postecoglou. You've got new challengers like Aston Villa as well. So Mikel Arteta has pressure on him. And I don't mean in terms of his job security. I just mean in terms of delivering results to keep Arsenal on this positive trajectory. With the support of the club, I sense wholeheartedly, and the vast majority of the fan base, certainly the match-going ones. You heard them singing his name pre-match in clips that went viral. But it's not a school playground. It's time to deliver. It's the big boys' world, and I think he can do that. But some tough decisions need to be made, and it is time to step up.
Yeah, Art. It's only last week we were talking about how Mikel Arteta's building a dynasty, right? Sod's law. They've gone on to lose the two games after that, right? We cursed it. Never say that. But real talk, though, David talks about big decisions needing to be made. I guess we look at the defensive solidity he's brought to Arsenal, and it's evolved into that. The midfield seems to be chiming in a different way. I guess that attacking space is definitely something that's glaringly obvious that Arsenal do need reinforcements in. But also, Mikel Arteta's not the only manager who's been hit with injuries this season. Perhaps he needs to trust some of those on the bench as well. Because you look at the bench yesterday, Fabio Vieira, Zinchenko, Jesus, Nketiah was there who came on, Smith Rowe. I mean, these are decent players who can do the job.
Yeah, I think it goes into a few different factors. One being a lot of what Mikel Arteta has put together is Arsenal being a team that is very much coached in what they do. So when you come up against a team who have prepared extremely well, like Bayern did, and cut off all your avenues forward, then you kind of have to second guess yourself because you're not almost relying on your individuality as a player. You're depending on seeing pictures you've seen time and again, and they weren't getting those pictures yesterday. So when it was time to maybe try something different, of course, Mikel Arteta goes to the tried and trusted substitutes, which are Leandro Trossard and Gabriel Jesus, who both created the equaliser in the first leg. But the issue was they didn't really have, I'd say, the traits to properly threaten Bayern Munich on the night. So you had Gabriel Martinelli, who was all pace, basically, and replaced by a player who's more, I guess, looking to get the ball to feet and isn't going to stretch Bayern Munich in behind. You have players on the bench who could provide that in Reiss Nelson and Emil Smith-Rowe, both very quick players. But as you mentioned, Ayo, I think when we talk about squad management, it's not just about bringing a player off the bench in the biggest game of the season, but also how do you actually prepare them for that moment? Because in recent weeks, he's rotated aside against Luton, 5 changes that night. Emil Smith-Rowe started and got man of the match. But it almost becomes a token gesture when you do that and then those players don't get any more minutes until this point. So I think one of the really big, I guess, evolutions Mikel Arteta still needs to make is how does he actually use his squad players at the right moments to get them to a stage both physically and mentally where they're able to have a real impact and where he can trust them to.
David, just a quick one. James McNicholas has dropped a piece on The Athletic, and just following on from what Art's just said, he made this brilliant comment, and he was like, the Champions League knockout showed Arsenal for what they are, an incredibly well organised, robust team who are not blessed with too many maverick match winners. This much we knew. And Mikel Arteta sort of alluded to that in his post-match when he's like, we were missing this magic, right? It was the magic. Do you buy that actually, looking forward, if we are to reinforce this team, then you need those maverick players that can, your Rodrigos of this world, your Vinicius Juniors of this world, that can literally create something out of nothing?
First thing to say is they're hard to come by. And if it was so straightforward, then Arsenal would already have them and many other teams as well. And that's the skill of recruitment and player development. I think Art's observation and his term token gesture is really very interesting, because after that Smith Rowe performance against Luton, you can say it was only Luton, and I don't mean that in a disrespecting way, but Arteta made the changes and it appears it was a one-off, but he was sensational, and we know what he can do. We know his style of play. We don't see him every day on the training ground. Mikel Arteta does, and so we bow to the judgment of him and his coaches. This is a player who, pre-injuries, he helped save Mikel Arteta. I don't mean from his job, but from more pressure that was coming on him all those years ago with Bukayo Saka. The song developed around those two, and since then their career trajectories have gone in pretty different directions, and the fitness issues are a clear concern, but he does offer the spark. We know what he can do, and I'm not saying he'll deliver it at all times. He came on against Aston Villa and found himself as the last man trying to defend against Ollie Watkins. That is not ideal, but just managing those minutes in preparation for nights like last night, if you need them, may be something that needs to be developed. I really don't want to preach towards a coach like Mikel Arteta, but it just seemed that he was a fish out of water when he came on against Villa in a horrible situation, and then you don't even see him last night. And I just love the qualities that he brings, and I think it's a player that is most likely to have to move on. He needs to play football, and if that's not going to be at Arsenal, then it's going to need to be somewhere else. Back to your fundamental question. This is why Arsenal are quite likely to look for a number 8 or somebody in that kind of creative role from the transfer window upcoming. Maybe a new striker, which we talk about so much and will continue to. Can Ethan Nwaneri be developed further? I suppose he can, and Arsenal will have really high hopes for him because he's just signed his first professional contract, and he showed in a cameo at West Ham this season that he's got a lovely touch and an eye for a pass, and let's see him getting some more minutes. What's happened to Fabio Vieira, a player who has suffered from some injuries himself this season, but does have something a bit different? Again, presumably the coaches don't feel he's ready for a night like last night to even impact it. A number of pieces have been written across the industry today about Mikel Arteta's lack of rotation, the amount of minutes his trusted and relatively small core have accumulated. It's quite telling that he hasn't turned to the bench as much as you might imagine. And I was watching last night thinking Bukayo Saka is just done here. He needs a rest. He needs a break. We know how influential he's been. We know the talent he brings for club and country. He is an absolute phenomenon and will continue to be for many more years. But it wasn't so much the sort of act of that free kick quickly taken or the corner that hit the first man, because we don't know if the free kick was taken with more poise and the corner reached the middle of the box that anything would have happened. It was just symbolic of a player who didn't really impact the game, had kind of lost his way, and yes, we know he can produce something out of nothing. He's been so dependable. But I think most of us, all things being equal, would say he should have gone off and he should have been replaced by somebody that could be really effective. And that will all form part of the introspection that Mikel Arteta and everybody involved at Arsenal takes. But definitely somebody that can produce that moment of magic, find a spark, thread a pass. Martin Odegaard can, but he's kind of the only player playing regularly
and
for Arsenal.
And he looked like he was puffing last night as well.
He did, but
he's done a lot of football this season.
He has played a lot of football. I've got to say, still thought he was Arsenal's standout performer. He does not stop running and tries to create relentlessly, and he's always looking for opportunities, but he can't do it on his own, and there will be some fatigue there. And imagine if you had the second Odegaard in the team, so the opposition are all looking at Martin Odegaard, somebody else pops up and nips the ball through, and we're constantly seeing links to some of these players, and that will come down to the likes of Edu and his recruitment department. If they are going to do that, if they see Declan Rice as being a 6 going forward, what happens with Jorginho and Thomas Partey? If it's an 8 they decide they want to go for, then they're going to need to come up with something, make the finances work, and provide Arsenal with that injection that I think many of us can see they need.
Yeah, Art, I basically was watching both matches back to back yesterday. I had my iPad on one side and the TV on the top. So I kept my eye on Manchester City, Real Madrid, and Pep Guardiola takes off Haaland, he takes off De Bruyne, 2 key players in that squad, and brings on Alvarez, and I can't remember who else he brought on. I mean, is this a depth issue? Because you could say Odegaard comes off, Fabio Vieira's waiting there, I mean, does he trust his depth?
I think that's a bigger question than, I guess, is it just a depth issue? Because he was actually a much more vocal and public fan of Fabio Vieira when he signed than most other signings he's made, from my memory. But as David said earlier, Fabio Vieira's had injury issues this season. He started the season quite well, making cameos off the bench and changing games. But then when he's come back in recent weeks, he too has struggled to actually get minutes off the bench. So would it be a case of Mikel Arteta looking at the bench and saying, oh, these guys aren't prepared enough? I did pose the question to him a few weeks back on whether these players would need rhythm, and he gave a very almost strange answer. It was a good line, but I think he basically said that you only need a second to change the history of a football club. And he was talking about Reece Nelson's goal against Bournemouth last season. But when we look at it in reality, I think if you asked a Reece Nelson or a Fabio Vieira, they would much prefer, say, at least 10 more starts in the season rather than that one moment, because they can be more effective on a consistent basis. And I think that's the real issue going into next season. How do you rely on not just 11, 12, 13 players, but closer to 16 and 17 like Pep Guardiola can? And I know the caveat there is the quality of players at Pep's disposal is a lot better, but it's all about building that and also building that trust as well.
Yeah, David, I guess you've sort of alluded to transfer targets and whatnot, but there's an air here that Arteta and Edu are willing to be patient. They're not going to go rush out and buy someone. They want someone who comes into this team who's ready to play.
Yeah, definitely. I think Arsenal's recruitment will be, and I'm not just talking immediately, but generally and going forward, there will obviously be a focus on the youth academy. We've talked about that on these podcasts before. I think there's going to be some investment to try and bring in better quality players at a younger age and really compete with rivals like a Chelsea, a Tottenham, in London in particular, to get hold of some of the country's best talent. Especially important post-Brexit, where the English market is being more fiercely fought over than ever before. And then at senior level, I do think they're in a phase of their journey where you're bringing in players to deliver now. We saw that with Declan Rice. You don't spend that sort of money on such a quality player because you want him to develop at your club solely. Of course, they want him to develop at their club, but they want him to deliver now. Gabriel Jesus, Alexander Zinchenko. In most positions you look at, David Raya, it wasn't, we're going to bring in a Rasmus Højlund, who Manchester United, despite the price tag, bought in as a developmental striker. They also wanted a more senior one, and that may come next at Old Trafford. They bought in, at Arsenal, Kai Havertz to deliver now. So I think for the first team, that will continue. And, some of the striker targets we're talking about, and we have on this pod before, the likes of Sesko and Gokaresh, they are quite young, but they are pretty experienced already for club and at international level too. We talked a bit about an Evan Ferguson, but he is more developmental, and I don't think that's one that's going to materialise for Arsenal at this particular time, largely because of the price tag, and he's not had a great season. But if you are going to pay that sort of money, even for an Evan Ferguson, it's to deliver now. And all the other strikers that have been linked with, the same would apply. Then you go into that sort of midfielder bracket. Somebody I think of off the top of my head that Arsenal and other clubs really like is Bruno Guimaraes. He can play in the 8 and the 6. Newcastle will hope to keep hold of him. There is a release clause, though. Anyone who's going to take him, he's got to deliver straight away. Arsenal may be looking, and I think James McNicholas wrote about this, to bring in a left-back. That left-back won't be to try and be the successor in 5 years' time, maybe like they did with Nuno Tavares, although that didn't really work out. Or a Sambi Lokonga in central midfield, where it was kind of experimental. And if they do come to the boil fruition, fantastic. If they don't, we'll look to trade elsewhere with the hope that their valuation has increased. And so I do see that continuing. And Arsenal are in a phase now where, despite what we saw largely towards the end of the Wenger reign, which was largely related to the finances at his disposal and the stadium move, etc., that was still a legacy when it came to the budget. And Arsenal's wish that financial fair play was going to be the solution to cure all ills and it was going to level the playing field. Now they're kind of in here and now mode. The Cronkies, the owners, have backed them in the market. We've got no evidence to suggest they won't continue to do so. Yes, they have to comply with the PSR rules. Yes, they've been close to the line on that, but that's going to be changing from the 25 to 26 season, in that you've got to spend a percentage of your revenue. If Arsenal can continue to up their revenues, then they'll be among the clubs that will have some significant resources at their disposal to spend. And so I'd be quite excited by that if I was an Arsenal fan, because their record in the transfer market of late has been pretty good. But it's important for fans, all of us, the public, nobody seems to like this word, to be patient. They've built progressively, quite impressively in the market. You can scrutinise each individual all you like, but I see an Arsenal that at the moment they brought those in, they've contributed. There haven't been many failures. I think Fabio Vieira is one that hasn't succeeded so far, but we know there's a player there and they will like to think they can still get more out of him. And therefore Edu and the recruitment team and Arteta, I think, deserve the credit to continue to build in these windows. But they do need to get it right, because I keep coming back to the competition from their rivals. And when I say like a Bruno or Sesko or whoever, these are just names that are kind of in the environment, that you're going to be in a fight for them, and finances will play a part. But Arsenal have done well at delivering the players that Mikel Arteta wants, or if they've missed out on their first choice, like they missed out on Lisandro Martinez, the alternative has been pretty good in the form of Zinchenko. Jurriën Timber was a brilliant signing, and it was so cruel that he suffered the ACL, but there's high hopes that he will come back and deliver. So I actually see Arsenal being a stronger, a more mature squad, but one that will look very different because of the amount of outs that I think need to happen, and therefore there will be some ins as well.
I want to touch on the outs in just a second, but super quickly in terms of the ins, Art, I guess bringing people in like Kai Havertz or even Ben White, who I think was brought in as a centre back.
Yeah.
It's interesting that actually the positions they're playing now in this squad aren't necessarily the positions that they were envisaged to play as well.
Yeah, I think there's two main pillars with Arsenal's recruitment strategy over the past few years. The first one, as David spoke about, is age profile, which I think when they started to get that right was when in 2021 they recruited 6 players under the age of 23 with the view to have them grow with the squad. It's worked with some players like Martin Odegaard, Takahiro Tomiyasu and Aaron Ramsdale. It's not worked with the others like Nuno Tavares and Sambi Lokonga. Then they kind of moved on from that thinking age-wise and went a bit older, say mid-20s with Gabriel Jesus and Zinchenko, but not too old to the fact where they couldn't have a proper impact on the team. So it was mid-20s players who had good experience. You saw it again with Declan Rice this summer. The other pillar is signing players based off their attributes rather than just a position they can play. So as you said, with Ben White, that came in handy because when Saliba came back from loan in Marseille and clicked with Gabriel, which Mikel Arteta was actually surprised by, it then became easier to move Ben White to right back, where he's been ever since, and he's arguably been one of the best right backs in the Premier League. With Kai Havertz, I think it's a bit more difficult because obviously he was brought in as a midfielder. That was what Arsenal almost said he was at the start, and that's what Mikel Arteta tried to do. And it wasn't until 5 months into his time at Arsenal that he was being used more often as a centre forward, and when it clicked. I don't think Arsenal can really afford to give players 5 months to click. And that's where David mentions needing people who are ready to make an impact right now, going forward. So I think those two kind of pillars are what will be the main ones they look at going into this summer. And if you can find someone like a Jurriën Timber who can play across the whole backline and do it extremely well, if you can find that in areas further forward, then you're looking at actually improving the team and the depth that we spoke about before.
Yeah, David, let's move on to outgoings, and I guess sales. You touched on it earlier, and we've spoken about the likes of Emile Smith-Rowe, Eddie Nketiah, who's not played much football this season at all. Especially from the academy standpoint, and you talked about PSR earlier. They represent pure profit. Do we see any of those players heading out? I mean, let's not even talk about Aaron Ramsdale as well, based on what we've seen this season. Yeah,
you turning this conversation to outs reminds me that it was also not so long ago that Arsenal were cleaning that dressing room, and they took some pain when the likes of Ozil and Sokratis and Mustafi and Kolasinac and later Aubameyang. You can debate this freely about whether they should have gone, whether Arsenal are weaker without an Aubameyang and Ozil, etc., etc. That's all history now. But their aim was to sort the dressing room out, sort the wage bill out. And when you see everybody's financial accounts being published recently, Arsenal have done good work on the salaries. And that should not be sniffed at. That's a really important factor in this. Many people know in football, it's not so much about the transfer fees these days. It's about the salaries. That really affects your costs. And will be a massive factor in the new squad cost controls with UEFA and the Premier League. They also, and by the way, on the salaries, I think Tottenham overtook them in the most recent financial accounts. Furthermore, on the agents' fees paid, there are teams that are way above them, the likes of Manchester City, Chelsea, Manchester United, Liverpool. So some credit to them on that. When it comes to the outs now, they really do have an opportunity to raise significant funds. Now, like many clubs, they might need to do a bit before June the 30th, the deadline for the next round of PSR, the cycle, 3 years to June 30th, 2024. And for many clubs, that may affect the price if you do need to get somebody out. I've talked on other podcasts about like an Aston Villa or Newcastle, Chelsea. And so we'll have to see with that on Arsenal. I don't know how close to the line they are. And then perhaps it will be slightly different after June the 30th when your finances are a little bit more clear. In terms of the personnel, maybe we'll start from the back. Aaron Ramsdale, I would expect to leave because he needs and wants to be playing football. It's a real shame, but that's how it works out sometimes. And David Raya is the clear number one. Whatever Mikel Arteta said at the start, he wanted to sign Raya before Ramsdale actually came to the club. And eventually it came to fruition. Arsenal need to turn the Raya transfer permanent. And Ramsdale, whether he leaves on a permanent basis or on loan, I assume will be heading out of the club, and they'll need to bring in a backup goalkeeper. There are big question marks over Zinchenko purely for the fact that you would normally be negotiating a new contract now if you're in his position, and I'm not aware of any talks taking place. So that situation will have to be addressed. He clearly isn't the regular starter by virtue of injury and selection that he was when he joined. Last summer, unexpectedly, there was a lot of speculation around Gabriel and interest from the Saudi Pro League. Is something like that going to come again, unexpectedly? I think Arsenal would hope to keep hold of him. And I don't know of any developing situation right now, but I didn't this time last year. And if somebody like that left, you'd have to look to bring in a replacement. You don't see any other significant movement along the back line, and the contractual status is really strong as well there. When you move into midfield, there are clear questions that need to be answered around Thomas Partey, who is approaching the final year of his contract. He barely plays for Arsenal anymore. He seems to be fit now, but is not really getting on the pitch and is not influencing. We know how good he can be, but recent times have not worked out how everybody would hope. I don't imagine he'll be getting a new contract. So do you sell or do you retain him as a player and you see that value in the final year as being better than a transfer fee? Jorginho, we know there's an option to extend the deal that expires this summer. Do Arsenal want to do that? I think they probably would from a footballing and leadership perspective. Does he want to do that? That's a really big question. You got Declan Rice there. If they need to bring in the number 6, Arsenal, we know, really like Martin Zubimendi at Real Sociedad. I'm sure other clubs do as well. There's a release clause there. Is he going to want to leave at all? They'll have other options too. You move a bit further forward and there are major questions about the future of Emile Smith-Rowe. If he is to leave, it would represent pure profit. The way his trajectory has gone since really signing that new contract and being given the number 10 shirt indicates that all parties may be open to a move, and there will definitely be interest in him. What about Fabio Vieira? I think he will stay just because he's newer, and there was a significant financial outlay, that 35 million-ish pounds, that Arsenal probably won't make a profit on. So perhaps it's better to hold on to him for the PSR reasons that you explain. Reece Nelson would represent pure profit too. There's always an element of interest in him. He decided to sign a new contract, but if he decides that it's time to go and play regular starting football elsewhere, then I could see a move developing. And then you come up to the front line, and that's really interesting because Eddie Nketiah, I think the minutes that he's receiving speak volumes. Maybe Mikel Arteta and Arsenal don't see him as one for them going forward. Some clubs or managers would then try and play them to put them in the shop window. But again, another big contract that was signed, and I know of clubs that like him too, yet he'll have a decision to make as well as Arsenal. And Gabriel Jesus, has time moved past him at Arsenal because he's been suffering from this recurring knee injury or multiple injuries. His goal output is not what he would expect or Arsenal would expect, and we know he's capable of. There's those amazing moments like Manchester United at home this season, but they've become so infrequent that if Arsenal are going to be bringing in a top level striker, you do imagine that they would have to at least consider any outside interest in Gabriel Jesus, even if it doesn't materialise, even if he gets fit and shows his versatility because he can also play wide. But these are serious questions that need to be answered, and what I've presented there as a whole is a squad that has a lot of value, and there is potentially a lot of movement to come. I didn't mention Kivior. He's one who until recently I would have said maybe there could be a move there. It hasn't quite worked out yet. Then he established himself, but since that torrid first half against Bayern Munich, maybe there's a bit of reality check there as well. So Arsenal have to be, clearly, when you look at all of that, one of the busier clubs in this summer transfer window in both the ins department and certainly outs.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't spoken about Tomiyasu, and he signed a 2-year deal, so, that's a really fascinating one to keep an eye on. Arts, very quickly, Jordan Campbell wrote about the likes of Zinchenko and Jesus and the Arsenal train moving so fast that if you do suffer with injury and you are not as consistent, that actually, maybe the train has pulled off and you're almost surplus to requirements. But I also look at all those names that David just spoken about. Arsenal haven't been that great at making profit from selling players. All the players that have gone in terms of, you look at Ozil, you look at Aubameyang, I mean, those are termination of contracts to a certain degree as well. Like, they haven't made much money. So, I mean, the impetus has to be bringing money in as well.
Definitely. When you look at the potential outgoings as well, you need to remember they do have players on loan who they couldn't sell permanently last summer. So Kieran Tierney at Real Sociedad, Nuno Tavares at Nottingham Forest, Albert Sambi Lokonga. I thought of Burnley because of Vincent Kompany, but it's Luton Town.
It's Luton.
But I think all these players as well represent, I guess, an opportunity to bring money in too, because they can't really be forgotten about. Yes, him too as well. So there is, I think, a lot of potential there for outgoings, but the big thing as well is actually selling them well. I don't think Arsenal, as you mentioned, I have done that to a degree of, say, Chelsea or Manchester City, where you see them selling sometimes players who haven't made a first team appearance for almost £20 million. Arsenal haven't been able to do that, really. The only example that really springs to mind is Flo Balogun last season, who went to Monaco for around 25 to 30 million pounds/euros, however you want to look at it. So going into this summer, I think that is an area where they really need to improve, because we talk about, I guess, increase in revenue, and yes, transfers are a way to do that, but I'd probably say the main way they've done that is through the Emirates opening up again, and then also this year the money that has come from getting back into the Champions League. And before that, we have to remember they had a season where they were out of Europe, so getting back into the Europa League was actually massive in terms of clawing back some of that revenue too. So I think when you're moving into this summer and summers beyond that, you need to start thinking about it, I guess, more fully in terms of the assets you have. And David mentioned putting these players in the shop window. I think that's also part of that, I guess, squad rotation and giving these players minutes, because this season and in seasons past, they haven't been able to really showcase to clubs what they can do. So when it becomes, I guess, the transfer window, clubs may not be willing to go permanently on them. They go for those loans instead.
Just a tiny point on that, really pertinent, and allied to the fact that there isn't a great deal of money in this PSR influenced market. I could see quite a few of these players going on loan with option or loan with obligation as opposed to permanent sales from Arsenal. And that effectively does what Art says about putting them in the shop window for a season. And then the clubs decide, okay, they're quality, we want to make an offer for them, and we're in a better PSR position under the new squad cost control rules, where they've got a little bit more to play with. So yeah, maybe let's not expect some massive raft of sales that brings in hundreds of millions of pounds, but there will definitely be player movement, and you would like to think revenue coming in for them, whether it's now or further down the line. In the meantime, Arsenal really need to work on their young players coming through, as well as Art talking about how tight the group that Arteta has been using is, and how little has been used from the bench, for example. But from the academy, when you talk to people around the club, it's really just Ethan and Miles. So Ethan Namweri and Miles Lewis-Skelly. And Ethan Namweri has had a little bit of game time. Miles Lewis-Skelly hasn't really. And there seems to be a bit of a vacuum, which is, it may just be cyclical. It may be due to some deficiencies in player development and work in the academy, and the same at all clubs. But when you look at a Liverpool or a Manchester City or a Chelsea or even a Tottenham, who are flush with these players, some are ready, some are not. Arsenal don't really have that in this generation. They do, you may have noticed, have some coming through at an even younger age group. And it's not right to hype up a 14-year-old, but just to say there are really positive feelings around somebody like Max Dowman. And there's a striker as well, Art will remind me of his name, who's been banging in the goals at youth level. And with what I talked about investment too, Arsenal clearly know the value from a footballing and financial perspective if they can increase the amount of players coming through their own system. And if you look at the team and much of what we've talked about today, yes, there's the Bukayo Saka exception, but that's kind of been it in Mikel Arteta's nucleus, if truth be told. And that's something that does need to improve going forward.
Yeah, that
who's the striker up?
That striker's Chido Obi Martin, Danish youth international. But I think he's still 16. His birthday is in December, so he turned 17 in December. But when you look, I guess, a little bit above that as well, there are contract situations with Amario Cozier-Dubry and Ruel Waters, who are both very highly rated and helped Arsenal's under-18s get to the FA Youth Cup final last season, and their contract situations haven't been resolved yet. They expire in the summer. So that's, I guess, another part of it where when I mentioned teams or clubs like Chelsea and Manchester City being able to sell players who haven't even made a first-team appearance for X million pounds, Arsenal aren't in the same position, because these guys are now in the last few months of their contracts. If they stay, that's great, but if not, you risk losing them for a very small fee, mostly compensation. So I think that's another part of the discussion that needs to be kind of looked at, because it's not just about what happens in the first team, but the academy as well, because that is also... it has been Arsenal's main source of profit, I'd say, when you look at Balogun, Iwobi, Joe Willock, Emi Martinez as well. They've been Arsenal's biggest sales of late, and they've all come from the academy.
I like that. All right, let's end it there, gents. David, Art, thanks so much for your time. You can also catch more reaction to Arsenal's defeat in Munich and what impact it could have on their Premier League hopes over on our dedicated Arsenal podcast, Handbrake Off. Don't forget to rate and review the podcast. That's it for me this week. Adam and the team are back tomorrow for weekend preview. Thank you so much for listening.